£93,000 in housing benefit every year. A Ministry of Defence that allowed 14 major projects to overrun, which at the last count are between them £4.5 billion over budget. A Department of Health which almost doubled the number of managers in the NHS. And a Treasury that sanctioned all of this because it published growth forecasts that were far more optimistic than independent forecasters. And look at how they did all this while at the same time doing so much damage to the fundamentals of our economy, letting it get completely out of balance by hitching our fortunes to a select few industries, accepting as a fact of life that 8 million people are economically inactive in our country, and allowing our economy to become far too dependent on a public sector whose productivity was falling, and far too hostile, I would argue, to a private sector that has now actually shrunk in its size to a level not seen since 2004. Nothing illustrates better the total irresponsibility of this approach than the fact that they kept ratcheting up unaffordable government spending even when the economy was shrinking. By the end of last year, our economy was 4% smaller than in 2007. But if you look behind the headline figures, you see why we face such a massive deficit crisis today. Because while the private sector of the economy was shrinking, the public sector was continuing its inexorable expansion. While everyday life was tough for people who didn't work in the public sector, with job losses, pay cuts, reduced working hours, falling profits, for those in the public sector, life went on pretty much as before. Since 2007, public spending has actually gone up by over 15%, some extra 120 billion in just 3 years. And while private sector employment fell in this period by 3.7%, public sector employment actually rose. So it has been, if you like, a tale of two economies, a public sector boom and a private sector bust. But there was a problem with this public sector splurge. The previous government argued that more spending would support the economy, conveniently forgetting that if you start with a large structural deficit, you ramp up spending even further, that is actually going to undermine confidence and investment rather than encourage it. So while the people employed by the taxpayer were insulated from the harsh realities of the recession, everyone else in the economy was starting to pay the price. And now, today, we're all paying the price because the size of the public sector has got way out of step with the size of the private sector. We're going to have to try and get it back in line, and that will be much more painful than if we'd kept things properly in balance all along. And the final part of the legacy is the fact the money the government put into the public sector did not make it dramatically better or more efficient. So while the cutbacks that are coming are unavoidable now, they could have been avoided if previously we'd spent wisely instead of showering the public sector with cash at a time when everyone else in the country was tightening their belt. So that is the overall scale and nature of the problem. And I want to be equally clear about what the potential consequences are if we fail to act decisively and quickly to cut spending, to bring our borrowing down and to reduce our deficit. If we do nothing, there are three possible scenarios. As we've seen, the best case scenario is that we pay increasingly punishing amounts of interest on our debt, dozens of billions every year, without ever actually paying our debts off. That huge drain on the public finances would threaten the money that could have been spent on the things we really want to spend it on. Improving the NHS, giving our children a better education, investing in our country's infrastructure. This, the best case scenario, I would describe as dire, unprogressive, a bad outcome for our country. But as I say, that's the best case. If we fail to confront our problems, we could suffer worse, a steady, painful erosion of confidence in our economy, because today almost every major country in the world is focusing on the need to cut their deficits. And the G20 has called on those countries with the biggest deficits to accelerate their plans for reducing them. If in Britain investors saw no will at the top of government to get a grip on our public finances, they would doubt Britain's ability to pay its way. That means they would demand a higher price for taking our debt, interest rates would have to rise, investment would fall. If that were to happen, there would be no proper growth, there would be no real recovery. There would be no substantial new jobs because Britain's economy would be beginning a slide to decline. These outcomes would be nothing less than disastrous, in my view, not just for our economy, but for our society too, and our vision of a Britain that we want to see, which is more free, more fair, and more responsible. But even more worrying is the example of Greece, a sudden loss of confidence and a sharp increase in interest rates. Now, let me be clear. Our debts are not as bad as Greece. Our underlying economic position is much stronger than Greece's. And crucially, we now have a government that I would argue has already demonstrated its willingness and its ability to deal with the problem. But Greece stands as a warning of what happens to countries that lose their credibility or whose governments pretend that difficult decisions can somehow be avoided. Thankfully, this is a warning that's now focused the attention of the international community. That is why we believe there's only one option in front of us: to take immediate and decisive action. That's why we've already launched and completed an in-year spending review to save £6 billion of public spending. It's why shortly our new independent Office for Budget Responsibility will set out independent forecasts for both our growth and our borrowing, so that never again can this country sleepwalk into such a massive debt crisis. Our actions have already been noticed around the world, and I'm glad the G20 summit this weekend explicitly endorsed the decisions that we've taken. So this is the sober reality that I have to set out for the country today. The legacy left by the last government is terrible. The private sector has shrunk back to what it was over 6 years ago. Unless we act now, interest payments in 5 years' time could end up being higher than the sums we spend on our schools, on climate change, and on transport combined. Because the legacy we've been left is so bad, the measures that we need to deal with it will be unavoidably tough. But people's lives, and this is vital, people's lives will be worse unless we do something now. The cause of building a fairer society will be set back for years unless we do something now. We are not alone in this. Many countries around the world have been living beyond their means, and they too are having to face the music. And I make this promise to everyone in Britain: you will not be left on your own in this. We are all in this together, and we are going to get through this together. We will carry out Britain's unavoidable deficit reduction plan in a way that strengthens and unites our country. We're not doing this because we want to. We're not driven by some theory or some ideology. We are doing this as a government because we have to, driven by the urgent truth that unless we do so, people will suffer and our national interest will suffer too. But this government will not cut the deficit in a way that hurts those we most need to help, in a way that divides our country, or in a way that undermines the spirit and the ethos of our vital public services. Freedom, fairness, responsibility, those are the values that drive this government. They're the values that will drive our efforts to deal with our debts and to turn this country around. So yes, it will be tough. I make no bones about that. But we will get through this together, and Britain and all of us will come out stronger on the other side. Thank you for listening. Now, we have some time for questions, so Libby.
Prime Minister, Libby Wiener, ITV News. You say we're all in this together. Does that include the right wing of your party who've been lobbying so hard against any tax rises?
It includes everybody. I mean, I would argue the government immediately signalled the sign that we're all in it together by actually saying we've got to start with ourselves, that ministers should take a pay cut, that ministerial limousines should be cut back, that we've got to make sure Parliament costs